In the impenetrable stillness of an early morning in 1623, a heartbreaking cry echoed through the marble walls of the Topkapi Palace. It was not the groan of a soldier wounded in battle, nor the final shout of an enemy dragged in chains. It was the scream of a girl, barely 15 years old, Princess Fatma Sultan, daughter of the most powerful sovereign in the world. Her voice cut through the corridors like knives of ice. Even the eunuchs who stood guard at the doors recoiled in dread, unwilling to step forward into that forbidden chamber. What unfolded that night was not a simple misfortune within the palace. It was the unveiling of the hidden price every daughter of the Sultan was destined to pay, a price carved into flesh and soul and silenced by history for 6 long centuries. Those cries were not born of a wound upon the body, but of a secret ritual meant to break the spirit before it ever touched the flesh, condemning royal daughters to a shadowed existence long before they came of age. For more than 600 years, this dark tradition was hidden behind gilded walls, only to resurface centuries later. The Ottoman Empire, vast as an endless ocean, stretched its power across 3 continents for more than 6 centuries, from 1299 until its fall in 1922. Its armies thundered from the walls of Vienna to the burning sands of Yemen, its banners casting shadows over Europe, Asia, and Africa. When Constantinople fell in 1453, that ancient city was reborn as Istanbul, the beating heart of an empire destined to endure. At the center of it all rose the Topkapi Palace, shimmering like a jewel of gold, the place where not only the fate of kingdoms was decided, but also the destinies of daughters born into its gilded cage. Behind its ornate courtyards and perfumed gardens stood a world few outsiders ever glimpsed, the imperial harem. It was no ordinary dwelling. It was a kingdom within a kingdom, sealed off from the outside world, guarded with secrets as tightly as with walls. At its peak, more than 800 women lived within its confines, each of them trapped in a universe woven of silk and shadows. Every glance, every step, every breath was observed. Every gesture carried the weight of reward or punishment. After 1530, when Sultan Suleiman elevated his beloved Hurrem Sultan with the unprecedented title of Haseki Sultan, the harem ceased to be only a place of pleasure. It became a battleground of whispers, intrigue, and influence. Ambitions sharpened like hidden blades. Alliances and rivalries flared beneath the painted ceilings. Here, women who had once been slaves, captured in distant European villages or bought in African markets, found ways to rise higher than generals, securing the Sultan's favor and carving their names into history. For many of these concubines, the harem, though gilded, offered opportunity. Taken from their homes, they could at least dream of power. They learned music, poetry, embroidery, and the art of subtle persuasion. They knew that if fortune smiled upon them, their chains could be melted into crowns. Yet, the same palace that granted power to some delivered torment to others. The daughters of the Sultan, princesses born into glory, into books of lineage and wealth, were not free to dream. Unlike concubines, they had no chance to win or lose on their own terms. They were not players in the game. They were the pieces themselves, placed on the board to seal alliances, calm rebellions, or buy loyalty. Each princess was a coin of flesh minted for politics. It was in this reality that Princess Fatma Sultan was born in 1606, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and his formidable consort Kosem Sultan, a woman whose power was said to rival that of emperors. Fatma's childhood unfolded among scented gardens and scholarly tutors. She read manuscripts in Arabic and Persian, studied the stars with court astronomers, and impressed learned men with her sharp mind and radiant charm. Chroniclers called her gifted, a girl of beauty and brilliance, a jewel of the dynasty. But brilliance was no shield against destiny. Her future had been etched long before her first words, written into invisible parchments that governed every royal child's life. Her fate was not to choose a husband, not to follow her heart, but to be handed over as part of a bargain, a living seal on an imperial pact. The man chosen for her was Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, a seasoned commander of the empire, hardened by wars against Persia. He was 20 years older, battle-scarred, loyal to the throne, and eager to climb higher through this marriage. For him, the union was a ladder to power. For her, it was the start of a tragedy she could not escape. By the time Fatma had grown into a young woman, her reputation as a prodigy filled the halls of Topkapi. She could converse fluently in 4 languages, write with the elegance of a poet, and debate history and law with the most respected scholars. But none of it mattered. Knowledge and talent could not rewrite a future carved by politics. From her first breath, her life had belonged to the empire. And so, as the wedding approached, the shadow of an ancient and terrible ritual fell over her. Months before the ceremony, she was placed into a process known as Turbe Mubarak, the sacred training. This was no preparation of joy or celebration, but a calculated breaking of the spirit, refined over generations to strip royal daughters of their will. What began as lessons soon became torment. What began as customs soon became chains. This was the secret hidden for 6 centuries, buried in silence and denied by official chronicles, a ritual that transformed the princesses of the greatest empire on earth into trembling shadows before they ever became brides. 3 months before her wedding day, Fatma Sultan was drawn into the most feared chapter of her short life, the ritual of Turbe Mubarak, or sacred education. To outsiders, the phrase sounded noble, almost divine, but behind the palace doors, its meaning was far darker. It was a system designed not to prepare, but to crush. It was crafted not to honor the princess, but to break her completely, reshaping her into a docile figure of obedience before she was ever placed in a marriage bed. The overseer of this process was Guler Hatun, a woman of 60 winters, chief of the harem, and witness to the training of more than a dozen imperial daughters. Under her iron gaze, the young princess was taken into the bridal chamber, a room adorned with Persian carpets, ebony panels, and mirrors meant to remind her of who she was and who she was meant to become. From dawn until midday, Fatma was drilled in endless rituals of reverence. She was forced to master 18 different bows, greetings, submissions, postures for serving, for lying down, and even for preparing herself in silence for the approach of her future husband. The very act of walking was no longer natural. Fatma was taught the Uruya and the Cei, measured steps, her head inclined at a strict 30-degree angle, her hands positioned carefully below her heart. Every gesture that once revealed her royal dignity was stripped away, replaced with movements designed to mold her into a living symbol of surrender. But the cruelest part of the ritual was not in the body. It was in the voice. Fatma's language, her power to speak freely, was stripped down to 43 permitted words. These words were only of gratitude, apology, obedience, or humble requests. Anything else, any slip into independent thought or free expression, was punished. Punishment came swiftly, a day of fasting until weakness overtook her body, hours of isolation in damp cells called rooms of reflection, public humiliation before the women of the harem and the eunuchs, judged like an object in a market. Every attempt at defiance was recorded. Every tear or tremor of resistance tallied against her until she bent to the will of her trainers. And still the harshest trial awaited her. Beneath the palace lay chambers built to mirror wedding rooms in exact detail. Here, in secret, the princesses were taken through talim and gerdek, rehearsals of the wedding night. In these cold rooms, wax mannequins crafted by Venetian artisans stood in place of husbands. Fatma was forced to practice gestures and acts that no innocent girl should have known. Every reaction, her fear, her hesitation, her tears, was noted and judged. If she resisted, the training was repeated. If she broke down, the sessions multiplied. Slowly, the bright young girl who had loved astronomy and poetry was hollowed out. Piece by piece, her brilliance was dimmed, her spirit subdued. She became not the daughter of emperors, but a shadow sculpted for submission. The training did not stop with her body and her words. Fatma was also subjected to psychological conditioning meant to reshape her mind. She was made to memorize verses from Ottoman and Persian treatises exalting obedience, sacrifice, and marital duty. Passages from texts like Nasihat al-Muluk were forced into her memory, recited before stern audiences who judged her tone and conviction. The goal was simple: to replace the free mind of a princess with the thoughts of a servant. Even prayer, once her personal connection to faith, was turned into another tool of control. 5 times a day she was commanded to kneel and repeat specially composed prayers, not ones of personal devotion, but invocations designed to erase individuality. Her supplications praised surrender. Her gestures mirrored those of a wife's obedience. Religion itself became a chain sanctifying her submission. And then came the ritual of humiliation. Twice a week in front of the entire female court, Fatma was ordered to serve her father's concubines. She washed them, combed their hair, fed them with her own hands, and even dressed them for their meetings with the Sultan. This was no simple duty. It was deliberate cruelty. The goal was to shatter her pride by forcing her to accept that even her father's lovers had authority over her. Witnesses later recorded that more than once the princess broke into uncontrollable sobs as she adjusted the garments of women destined to share her father's bed. Her tears did not move her overseers. They were only proof that the ritual was working. By the time weeks turned into months, the once radiant Fatma Sultan was unrecognizable. Her books lay closed, her laughter was gone. The girl who had dreamed of the stars was now a figure molded in silence, stripped of self, and reshaped into a vessel of obedience. The sacred education had achieved its purpose. The empire had transformed its jewel into an instrument of alliance, ready to be given away. 1 week before the wedding, the training intensified. Fatma Sultan was moved to the Galen Kirk, the bride's pavilion, a secluded wing of the palace where no sound from the outside world could reach her. Here, every aspect of her existence was controlled with cruel precision. Her meals were measured, not for pleasure, but for purpose. Pomegranates, almonds, goat's milk, honey, and spices brought from Yemen. Each ingredient was chosen for its symbolic or physical effect, believed to prepare her body for the sacred union. Her daily baths were overseen by specialists in purification, who poured over her skin mixtures of valerian, poppy, and bitter orange blossoms. The oils devised by alchemists trained in Cordoba and Samarkand were more than perfumes. They were subtle drugs meant to induce calm, compliance, and the slow surrender of the self. The walls around her were covered with silken tapestries, but instead of scenes of triumph or beauty, they depicted obedient wives of Ottoman and Islamic tradition. Women praised for submission, fertility, and silence. Their woven faces stared at her day and night, whispering wordless lessons of what she must become. Even the mirrors were weapons. Venetian glass was arranged so that wherever she stood, Fatma could not escape her own reflection. The practice, once a mystical Sufi meditation known as muraqabah, was twisted into an instrument of psychological control. Forced to look at herself endlessly, she became both prisoner and jailer, monitoring her own posture, her own thoughts, her own obedience. In this confinement, Fatma began to realize she no longer owned her life. Her voice, her body, her dreams, all of it had been stolen and molded by the empire. The girl who once studied the heavens now gazed into mirrors, searching not for stars, but for fragments of the self she had lost. And then, at last, the wedding day arrived, March 15, 1623. From dawn, the city of Istanbul pulsed with music, incense, and celebration. The streets filled with processions, golden dishes overflowed with feasts, and the air rang with Persian songs and Andalusian dances. To the people, it was a day of glory, a gift to the heavens. To Fatma, it was the tightening of chains. Chroniclers describe her face that day as pale, her lips dry, her eyes unfocused. Palace physicians, carefully noting her condition, recorded what today we would call panic attacks: trembling hands, cold sweats, a racing heart, and sudden breathlessness. While the empire celebrated, she sat silent, drowning in dread. When the last of the guests departed and the torches dimmed, the most feared procession began. The princess, heavily adorned in bridal garments, was led to the Gerdek Oda, the nuptial chamber, a special octagonal pavilion built deep within the palace gardens. Its design was no accident. Divided into 3 levels, each represented a stage: submission, purification, surrender, and consummation. On the first level, Tahakatkai, Fatma was bathed for hours in waters scented with damask rose, ambergris, and sandalwood. Her body was anointed with ointments laced with diluted opium and mandrake root, substances meant to blur the mind and dull resistance. What should have been a bridal blessing became a chemical surrender. On the second level, Teslim Kat, she was dressed in bridal silks. From a distance it looked like a gown fit for a queen, white silk threaded with gold and pearls. But hidden within were cords and clasps designed for restraint. The crown weighed heavily, limiting her movement. Bracelets and anklets glittered but subtly restricted her. Even her shoes with their thick soles made escape impossible. Her wedding garments were not an honor. They were a prison stitched in gold. Meanwhile, her future husband, Kara Mustafa Pasha, was not engaged in celebrations of love. Surrounded by advisors and military veterans, he was instructed in methods of dominance, words to intimidate, gestures to assert power, strategies to impose authority over a princess of royal blood. The empire had prepared both sides, ensuring there would be no room for disobedience. Finally, at the top level, Sift, the chamber of consummation, the truth of her fate awaited. The walls were covered with tapestries depicting Ottoman victories, cities burned, armies crushed, captive women paraded in chains. The message was unmistakable. The marriage bed was to be seen as another conquest. The furniture itself, crafted by artisans, contained hidden mechanisms for restraint. The air smelled of oils and herbs that dulled resistance. And so the young girl who once dreamed of constellations was led into a room designed not for love, but for defeat. That night her marriage would be remembered in official records as a triumph of dynasty. But for her, it marked the beginning of a private tragedy that would scar her soul forever. When the final doors of the Kift Katkai closed, Fatma Sultan stood alone with her husband. The celebrations outside had ended. The music had faded, and only silence remained. Within those walls, the fate of the young princess was sealed. Palace physicians later described her condition that night as a total collapse of the spirit. Months of discipline, humiliation, and forced obedience had broken her so deeply that when the moment arrived, she was no longer the girl she once was. Her body shook uncontrollably, her lips moved in whispers no one could understand, and her eyes drifted into emptiness, as though she were staring at another world. At first, Kara Mustafa Pasha believed it to be defiance. He had been trained to expect resistance, to interpret silence as pride, and to crush it with intimidation. He used the techniques he had been taught, harsh words meant to belittle, gestures of power designed to assert dominance, calculated touches to impose control. But soon he realized there was no rebellion to fight. What lay before him was not defiance, it was absence. Fatma had already retreated into herself, escaping into a silence deeper than chains. The records of the time, written in coded Persian notes, described what followed as a scene of despair. Hours passed in futile attempts. The girl's body trembled. Her mind seemed to drift far away, and finally, when the union was forced upon her, the consequences were catastrophic. Hemorrhages, repeated loss of consciousness, and what palace doctors called ruh sukme, the flight of the soul. From that night forward, Fatma was never the same. In the days that followed, her behavior alarmed even the harshest overseers of the harem. She developed what physicians called selective mutism. She spoke only when directly questioned, and even then, only in faint whispers. Her appetite disappeared completely. Servants reported that she often had to be fed by force. Sudden bursts of weeping overcame her for no reason at all, lasting for hours. Worse still, she showed signs of what the court named the sickness of fear. The mere sight of a man, even a eunuch trusted within the palace, could trigger violent panic. Her breathing quickened. Her body shook with cold sweat, and at times she fainted on the spot. The physicians of the empire, relying on their ancient medical texts, labeled it virginal melancholy, a condition they claimed was common among royal brides after their first night. In modern words, it was trauma, carved so deeply into her spirit that no simple remedy could heal it. Desperate to restore her, the palace tried every treatment they knew. Herbal infusions, songs played by court musicians, even Sufi meditations guided by religious scholars. None of it restored the brightness she once carried. The girl who once debated with scholars, the child who gazed at the stars and composed poetry, was gone. What remained was a hollow figure, obedient, silent, and broken. The marriage itself became a hollow ritual. Outwardly, Fatma Sultan fulfilled her role. She bore children, appeared at ceremonies, and stood as the beautiful wife of Kara Mustafa Pasha. But within the walls of her home, silence reigned. Even her husband, hardened by war, reportedly drowned himself in military campaigns and opium, trying to escape the guilt of being the instrument of her ruin. Fatma lived for 29 more years after that fateful night, but she never escaped its shadow. Her days passed in muted obedience, her books closed, her instruments of learning covered in dust, and the palace gardens she once adored abandoned. She became not the vibrant princess she was born to be, but a quiet ornament of the court, a body present, a soul absent. When she died in 1652, the official records declared her death the result of a fever. But many in the palace whispered that her passing, on the anniversary of her wedding, was no coincidence. For them, it was the final weight of memory crushing down on a soul that had never healed. Her story, tragic as it was not unique. The archives, uncovered centuries later, revealed that dozens of Ottoman princesses suffered the same fate. Some withdrew into silence, others sought escape through madness or death, and a few disappeared entirely from the records, as though they had never existed. The machinery of empire, precise in its rituals and merciless in its protocols, had ensured that these women, born into unimaginable power, became its first victims. Fatma Sultan's tragedy was not an isolated case. Her story, preserved in fragments of hidden records, mirrors a pattern that stretched across generations of Ottoman princesses. The newly uncovered palace archives revealed that many daughters of sultans endured the same torment. Some lived on in silence, retreating into mutism like Fatma. Others tried to escape through desperate acts, sudden madness, suicide, or vanishing into obscurity. Their names erased as if they had never existed. The empire, meticulous in its records and rituals, was equally skilled in erasing inconvenient truths. These women, born to embody the glory of the dynasty, were instead its quiet sacrifices. Documents translated in recent years describe heartbreaking details. Princesses who feigned their own deaths to avoid being forced into a second marriage, sisters who invented secret codes to communicate in whispers across the walls of their confinement, and a few who, with unimaginable courage, dared to petition the Sultan himself for divorce, openly defying a system thought to be unbreakable. These hidden stories remind us that even in the darkest corners of history, sparks of resistance still glowed. But for most, like Fatma, the empire's weight was inescapable. To the outside world, Ottoman princesses were imagined as symbols of luxury and splendor, surrounded by silk, jewels, and servants. The reality was far colder. Their lives were scripted as instruments of political control, their wills crushed beneath rituals perfected over centuries. The harem, often romanticized as a place of beauty and intrigue, was also a theater of silence, humiliation, and carefully hidden suffering. What the people of the empire were told were fairy tales of princesses was, in truth, a carefully staged illusion, a mask covering a machinery of obedience and control. And with each generation, more daughters were sacrificed to maintain the empire's fragile balance of alliances. The rediscovered records raise haunting questions. If this was the hidden fate of Ottoman princesses, what secrets still lie buried in the courts of Europe, Russia, or China? What rituals, too dark to be written in official chronicles, were endured by the daughters of kings and emperors elsewhere? How many lives were consumed? How many voices silenced in the name of preserving dynasties? The truth about Fatma Sultan pulls back the curtain on 6 centuries of silence. It shows us that beneath the shimmering surface of history, the voices of women were smothered, their suffering concealed behind gilded walls. And it reminds us that the cost of power is often paid not by the rulers themselves, but by those closest to them, their wives, their daughters, their sisters. For 600 years, this story remained buried. Today, we uncover it not as a tale of romance, but as a warning. Power without compassion devours even its own blood. If the tragedy of Fatma Sultan has shaken you, then stay with us, because many more secrets wait to be revealed. Share this story with those who believe history is only about kings and battles, and let them see the silent sacrifices hidden in the shadows. And before you leave, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. In the comments, tell us which queen or princess's fate you wish to see uncovered next. Perhaps a Russian Tsarina feared even by her own family, a Chinese empress bound by rituals of terror, or a European princess forced into a marriage that destroyed her. Because only by telling these truths can we strip history of its disguises and finally hear the voices of those who were silenced for centuries.